Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dale Norton, and welcome to Meier Supply's webinar on phase-out HFCs, and that includes Chemours as well. So we have some important and timely topics to discuss that impact each of our businesses. So beginning in a short 2 weeks, that's January 1st, the EPA is limiting the amount of HFCs that manufacturers can provide to industry. Now that represents a 10% drop in the availability of some very popular refrigerants. You know, that those are such as that it would include like 410A, 404A, and there's a large list of others associated with that. And then in 2 years past that, that number will drop to 40%. So these are some substantial changes, considering there's no replacement. Currently for 410A, some replacements are flammable, and there's blends that are just much more difficult to reclaim. So we've been through this before in prior years, but trust me, this time, it's different. It's not just a refrigerant that's being phased out. It's a whole collection of HFCs that we keep on our trucks and we keep in our warehouses, and that our customers are, that they're readily accessible today. And then, so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what the next 10 to 15 years may look like for us and how we may best navigate them and what we can expect. So before we get started, some housekeeping. We've got two great speakers that are going to be presenting today. We've left time at the end for questions from yourself and the audience, in which our own Brian Jesse will be moderating. And all attendees right now are muted, so you'll want to enter your questions in the Q&A or the chat sections that you see. And if at the end we're not able to answer all the questions, at least inside the next hour or so, we do have everybody's email address, and we'll be providing a summarized response from our experts to any unanswered questions. So feel free to enter any questions. There's a number of questions that you'd like to have in there. And I'm also told that we're recording this session, so we'll be sharing that in the same email. So like I mentioned, we've got two great speakers from Chemours to help us to better understand the changes that are in front of us. First off is Mark Love. Mark is a senior account manager for Chemours, formerly known as DuPont Refrigerants. Mark has over 35 years of experience in the chemical industry. He's spent the last 17 years working for DuPont Chemours in the HVAC industry. He has extensive knowledge of the refrigerant industry, including the new refrigerant regulations and their impacts. Mark graduated from Drexel University with a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering, and then followed that up with his MBA from Shenandoah University. He's married to his beautiful wife, Linda, and together they've got 3 children. Mark enjoys spending his time in South Jersey Shore and with many different outdoor activities. He's a rabid Eagles fan. We won't hold that against him, and enjoys playing the occasional pickup basketball game. Mark, thanks for joining us. And following up with Mark is Andrew Pendua. Andrew is a technical service engineer for Chemours Refrigerants. He holds a master's degree in chemical engineering from Lehigh University. And over the past 8 years with Chemours DuPont, he has primarily been focused on the development of next generation refrigerants for the HVACR industry. His assignments have included the quantification of performance for next generation HFO refrigerants in controlled laboratory settings, and working in the field with end users to optimize their refrigeration systems. So with that, Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you, my friend.
Okay, thanks, Dale.
Yes, sir.
And as Dale mentioned, we're going to be stepping through a lot of material. So as we go through, if there are questions, please use the chat function because both myself and Andrew really want to get through the content in about 40 to 45 minutes to allow for some Q&A. Okay, so with that, I'm going to get started. So to start at sort of a high level, to get, I guess, everybody grounded, last December, almost a year ago, the AIM Act was passed and into law. The AIM Act, which was passed last December, stands for American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. And in essence, what this AIM Act did was provide the EPA with the authority to regulate a phase down of HFCs. So for all of you that have lived through and the the Montreal Protocol, and the phase out of CFCs. The AIM Act provides the EPA the regulatory authority to phase down HFCs. So I'm going to step through the sort of the initial part of what this phase down looks like and how it's going to be impacting you certainly over these next 2 years. But as we take a look at the phase down, you'll really get a view of how it's going to impact you for the next decade. Okay. So with this, you can see here this is the AIM Act HFC phase down. It was published the end of September. And as you see, in some respects, it's very similar to the phase down of R22, but there are some key differences. I would start by saying this is probably, if there are a couple things that you take away from today's presentation, this chart is one of those. This is sort of one of the key sort of takeaways from today, is this phase down schedule. So as Dale had mentioned, effective January 1st, the industry will be moving into a capped environment. So January 1st, 2022, all manufacturers, similar to 22, will be capped. And starting in January, they not only put a cap in place, but they also take a 10% reduction. And then that cap will remain in place for 2 years. And then there's an additional 30% drop in 2024. The cap will remain in place for another 5 years. It will drop again by an additional 30%. And then you can see in these outlying years over the next 7 years, it'll drop by another 15%. Okay. A couple distinctions that I want to make with this production cap that's different than R22. With the R22 phase out, it was a complete phase out. Thou shalt no longer produce. That is not the case with this phase down. You can see here at the end of the phase down, which is in 2036, there still will be a 15% production cap in place. So there still will be product produced 15 years from now. Okay. The other big part that I want to highlight about this HFC phase down that is different than R22. R22 was a single product and it's a single molecule. So the unit of measure was pounds. That is not the case with this HFC phase down, because we are dealing with a basket of not only products, but components. So the unit of measure is not pounds. The unit of measure is what is called CO2 equivalent. So if a product or a component was released, what is that product's CO2 equivalent? The way that we measure it in this industry is by a component or a product's global warming potential number. So how I like to describe how the cap will work is, if you look at the two most prevalent products in our industry, the HFCs, this would be 410A and 404A. 410A has a CO2 equivalent, its GWP number of 2100. 404A has a GWP number of around 3800. Okay, so if we look at those two products, as manufacturers, we have a CO2 equivalent cap. So in the eyes of the EPA, we have one of two options. We could make 2 pounds of 410A, or we could make 1 pound of 404A. The CO2 equivalents are roughly the same. So the net effect on this phase down, that is a phase down of CO2 equivalents, is the products that have high GWP will be impacted more. Why? Because they count more against the CO2 equivalent cap. So you'll hear that throughout the presentation. And as Andrew gets into, what are the options? I mean, big picture, this cap is designed for one thing and one thing only, and that is to transition the industry from high GWP containing products to low GWP or low CO2 equivalent products. The last thing before I move on from this chart is I'm going to overstate the obvious, but if you look at this phase down schedule, almost all the action occurs over these next 7 years. Out of an 85% total drop, 70% of it is happening between now and 2029. So, as Dale had mentioned, we're used to a phase out with 22. That was sort of a little bit prolonged. This one's not going to be the case. There's going to be quite a bit of action and transition during this decade. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move on. As I mentioned here, this is just to sort of calibrate everybody. 404A in refrigeration is the bell cow. This is sort of the dominant refrigerant that we use in refrigeration. And also, along with 507, happens to be the two highest GWP refrigerants that are used. You look at a lot of other refrigerants here, 407A, 22, 407F, they're also used in refrigeration. These are sort of in the medium range. And then here you've got the 448s and 449s that are at the lower range. So as we mentioned with the cap's designed to move from high GWP products to low GWP products. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. What Andrew's going to be talking about is this conversion, this transition from high GWP products. How do we get here? How do we start using the 449s of the world? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. And then Andrew, I'm going to drive the presentations. You just say next slide when you need me to move it.
Got it. Thanks, Mark. And good afternoon, everybody. So kind of reinforcing what Mark just covered, if you look at the refrigerant industry and more specifically, the different types of refrigerants that have been used throughout the years, you'd be hard pressed to find an industry that has been as reactionary as ours has been. I mean, from going from the CFCs to the HCFCs to the HFCs, there's been a lot of change in the industry. And I think that really the push now is to get to the lower GWP solutions, which are really going to be a mix of things like industrial chemicals, as well as HFOs and HFO containing blends. In general, when we do trainings on refrigerant selections, really the one point we try to reinforce is that when you're trying to make your option of, hey, what refrigerant should I put into my system? That answer needs to really balance performance. So it should have a proper capacity. It should have very strong energy efficiency. It needs to be safe to use. It needs to be sustainable. And you really need to consider the total cost of ownership of the system. There's studies out there that show if you go to something that has higher energy consumption, sometimes that can counteract some of the sustainability goals that the industry is trying to achieve. So if you go to the next slide, Mark. That's kind of where our HFO blends play well, is trying to balance all those different components that really are important when making a refrigerant selection. So the HFO based blends that we have been inventing and introducing to the market, really we were trying to balance all those important things. So sustainable, I mean, they're non-ozone depleting, they have low global warming potential. High performance. So we'll discuss the performance in some of the later slides. So you can see how products like 449A compare to R22 or 404A. Safety. So that's another big one. They all the retrofit refrigerants we're going to be talking about today, they have the same safety classification as the refrigerants that the industry has been using pretty much all along. And then costs. So, a lot of these refrigerants, especially the ones with lower GWPs longer term, are going to be really help with that as well. So if you look at it, I'm not going to turn this into a chemistry class today, but the difference between an HFC and an HFO really is there's a double bond on an HFO, which allows for the shorter atmospheric lifetime compared to the HFCs. So in essence, you can add small amounts of HFOs to HFCs to make lower GWP blends that can meet or exceed the incumbent refrigerant performance of, say, like a 404A or a R22. So if you go to the next slide, Mark. In general, you may have heard that so 1234YF, which is the base HFO molecule, it's actually being used as a replacement for R134A in mobile air conditioning today. So it has very similar operating conditions to 134A. Its capacity and efficiency are very similar, but, and this is a term that you will hear sometimes with HFOs, is the neat HFO molecule. So 1234YF is a mildly flammable refrigerant. So the industry has been using mildly flammable refrigerants for a very long time now. Take R32, for example. So R32 is 50% of the 410A blend. That is also a mildly flammable component. So this isn't something that's necessarily unprecedented for the industry, but the difference between 1234YF and some of the HFCs that are mildly flammable is 1234YF also has that very low GWP, which you could see in the green row on the table to the right. So when blending, so if you take something like 407A, for example, 407A has 3 components in it. It has R32, R125, and R134A. With the introduction of 1234YF to the industry, you can add 1234YF in replacement for 134A and get much lower GWPs than some of the incumbent refrigerants had. So that's kind of the really the method to the madness of how the blending works with 1234YF. If you can go to the next slide, Mark. So we have we believe that 1234YF is a great long-term sustainable solution for the HVACR industry. We have the world's largest HFO plant, which is in Corpus Christi, Texas. So, this is a product that we are ready to serve the industry with to make lower GWP solutions to meet some of the regulations that are coming down the pipe. So if you go to the next slide. In this presentation, we're going to mostly focus on the left side, but you may start hearing, especially as we reach the tail end of the phase down. So if you start looking, way in advance, there could be the introduction of mildly flammable refrigerants in commercial refrigeration. So those are going to be the XL series refrigerants. They're really only going to be used in new pieces of equipment. Right now, I think the industry, especially in the USA, is at a place where the codes and standards are still trying to be updated so that these can safely be used in the industry. But today we're really going to focus on the XP series refrigerants. So the XP series refrigerants are the low GWP, non-flammable replacements for the incumbent refrigerants such as 134A, R22, R404A. So these are going to be good for both retrofit of existing equipment or even, given some of the things that are happening with 404A today, these could be used in new equipment today. And we'll cover some of the retrofit steps from moving from 22 to 404A. But in essence, when we have trainings on products for retrofits, the main goal of a retrofit is really to make sure that we are keeping the existing equipment running. So you're maintaining that capital purchase in your equipment for as long as possible, right? Because whether it be supply in the case of 22 or something else that's causing the end user to want to switch refrigerants, If we can keep that existing equipment running and keep it running efficiently with a new refrigerant, that is a really great solution considering the regulations that are in place. So if you go to the next slide. This is our roadmap of different refrigerant options for different applications. So if you're looking at a low temp, medium temp application for say 22 or 404A 507, generally our recommendation is going to be to go to 449A. We'll cover a lot of what 449A is on some of the later slides, and I'm sure some of you have likely used this refrigerant already. In the 404A 507 space, we also have 452A or XP44. So that one is, it's actually probably one of the closer performance matches to 404A, but it's limited in use due to its higher GWP versus say like a 449A. So they both work as 404A replacements, but there's specific applications such as transport refrigeration and low temperature condensing units that I believe have SNAP approval for 452A. If that is a fluid that you are interested in using, I would highly suggest looking at the SNAP program beforehand to see if it is an approved application for that refrigerant. In the 134A space, we have XP10 or 513A. So 513A is an interesting refrigerant because it has a GWP of 537 and is non-flammable, right? So in the industry today, there's really not many refrigerants that can tout that kind of viability. So I think long-term, that's going to be a very interesting refrigerant to work with. It has very similar properties to 134A. And then you could see in the black boxes, we have our XL series of refrigerants. So those are products like XL10, so that's neat 1234YF, like that gets you a GWP less than 1. Right. So as a pure HFO, really, it doesn't even, it's accounted differently than the HFC phase down. So that's as codes and standards get updated and the introduction of mildly flammable refrigerants comes to the industry, those are going to be very strong refrigerant candidates for new installations. In the 404A 507 and the 22 columns, we have the one product I'm going to highlight is XL20 or 454C. Sometimes in the industry, in different applications, you may hear a number of GWP less than 150 thrown around. This is going to be our GWP less than 150 solution. So again, this is something the industry is working towards right now. This isn't something you're going to see in a warehouse tomorrow, but it is definitely something to start keeping an eye on. And if you have an interest in, either studying that product or trialing that product, I mean, reach out to us because I think it's something that is in the pipeline, and we're going to want to see really how it works in the industry as we move forward. So if you go to the next slide. So 449A. 449A is really, I would say, the workhorse refrigerant of our portfolio to meet or exceed the regulations that are coming down the pipeline. So the reason it's a very strong candidate is if you look, and Mark mentioned before, 404A has long been the primary refrigerant used in refrigeration. And if you look at the next, I believe it's the next 8 years, so that gets us to 2029, you're going to have roughly a 70% reduction in the cap. If you look at if you look at 449A, it has a 67% lower GWP than 404A or 507. So it's a really strong way to really lower your dependency on, the carbon emissions, which are being counted as really the way the regulations are pushing forward. It's very generally a performance match to 22. So a lot of things like the energy consumption, the performance, it's all going to be dependent on the retrofit being done properly in a retrofit situation. So, we have a number of case histories out there that show that, yeah, in some cases you can see up to 12% energy savings for 404A and 507 design systems using this product. It has the ASHRAE Class A1 rating. So that means it is non-flammable, low toxicity, just like 22, just like 404A, just like any refrigerant that the industry has been used to working with. it's compatible with the installed base. So we talked about this before when looking at retrofits. I don't want to be changing out all the evaporators or the condensers or the the compressors to use a new refrigerant if the equipment still has a usable lifetime. So really the main goal of doing these retrofits is going to be to try to make sure that you're using a product that's compatible. It's commercially available, and it's going to be similar to working with a lot of the refrigerants the industry's been using throughout the years. So if you go to the next slide. We can go to the next slide as well, Mark. This slide's just really reiterating a lot of what was already discussed. And then, so again, for retrofits, and I cannot stress this enough, we really want to keep that existing equipment running. So 449A, we'll look at some of the performance metrics on some of the later slides, but we want our equipment to be simple and easy to service. We want to minimize the cost, right? So if we're keeping the existing equipment running and it's simple and easy to service, then we should expect that the cost can also be minimized. And we want to use something that can be there from both a product perspective and from a supply perspective for a long time, right? We want to make sure that we're compliant long term. For a retrofit, really the main thing I could stress is you need to make sure that you're using a refrigerant that has the same safety classification as the incumbent. The safety of the system is going to be key. So if you go to the next slide, Mark. When looking at an R22 conversion, really the first step that we always like to discuss when doing trainings is reviewing the retrofit guidelines. So we have detailed retrofit guidelines on our website that include everything like the PT charts, learnings from the field, pretty much anything that we learn from yourselves, really, we try to put into this retrofit guideline so that we have the latest and greatest information for really what's working to make these conversions successful. The two steps I really want to stress though on an R22 conversion is if you want an R22 conversion to be successful, the first thing that you need to make sure that you do is you change the oil to POE. Likely you're going to need to, or it will be recommended to do multiple oil changes. So, 2 at a minimum, but our retrofit guidelines highlight a residual mineral oil level that we recommend in a system. But, the way we've seen it work in the field with contractors is they'll do the first oil change while the system is still running on R22. And that's typically a good thing. When you do that first POE oil change and you've had a system that's been running on mineral oil for a long time, that POE will, it can clean the inside of the lines and start circulating a lot of stuff that really shouldn't be circulating in a refrigeration system. So that first oil change really is twofold. One, to continue to get a lot of the mineral oil out of the system, and also, make sure that you're getting any kind of debris that could be cleaned off the lines out of the system as well during that second oil change. The other big step to remember, and this is, it's very important that this is scoped when looking at 22 conversions in general, is changing the critical elastomeric seals. So anytime you've had a system that has been exposed to R22 and mineral oil for an extended period of time, over time, you could see that the seals start to swell. So the R22 actually dissolves into the seal and really causes it to expand. And when you remove the R22 from the system, you also, to a certain degree, remove the R22 out of the seals. And the seals can start to deform. And one of the things that's true for really any conversion you do, so whether it be a 449A conversion or even a 407A conversion, any HCFC to HFC conversion, when you change those critical elastomeric, or without changing those critical elastomeric seals, the HFCs don't really give the same seal that was there for the 22 when the system was running on R22. So changing out those critical elastomeric seals, you can use the same type of material, is really critical to make sure that your system does not leak post retrofit. Really, the only other thing I'm going to bring up here for this as well is optimizing the set points. So one of the differences between, say, 449A or 407A, or really any of the R-4 refrigerants, especially compared to 22, is they have temperature glide. So when looking at the temperature you want to set your evaporator at, you want to make sure that you are setting it such that you're compensating for the glide. So for an evaporator, for example, if you, I 9 times out of 10, if a system is not optimized for a glide, you're actually running your evaporator a little colder than you need to be, which is going to result in larger energy consumption and slightly lower capacity. So optimizing for the glide is really critical in making sure you have a well-running system for a refrigerant with temperature glide. If you go to the next slide, Mark. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I think this is something that really you need to ask yourself when looking at a refrigerant selection. So if you're starting from ground zero, and you need to ask yourself, what's important for a refrigerant when looking at what I need for my system. Really, the 6 metrics we train on, and when we get asked, will a refrigerant work in a system? Really what that can be boiled down to is, what are the capacity differences? Is it as energy efficient? Will the mass flow differences cause changes in line sizing or issues with the TXV? What are the pressure differences, and how will that impact where I hit my set points to make sure I'm running the system optimally? And then what are the discharge temperatures? So discharge temperature is a really big one. When you're looking at 22, if I were to give you the 1-minute summary, R22 probably runs hotter than really any other refrigerant that's going to be used in the refrigeration industry. So one of the nice things about these retrofits is likely you're going to go to a refrigerant with a lower discharge temperature than R22 at the same conditions. So for low temperature refrigeration, especially, any type of discharge temperature mitigation that's on the system already will likely be sufficient for 449A. If you look at capacity and energy efficiency, it's very similar. There's really no large differences there to note on. And then mass flow. So at a mass flow of roughly 11 to 14% greater based on the conditions noted, which are typical low temp, medium temp evaporator conditions. In a retrofit, you're really not going to see a situation where you would have to, say, change line sizing or even the body of the TXV. Typically, we've seen in the field that all those will be compatible with the incumbent equipment, which is great, because that's really the whole goal of this, is to keep that existing equipment running. So if you go to the next slide, Mark. So for 404A conversions, and I think this one really is important to stress, because there is a step in this that, if you haven't done 404A conversions already, is going to be important for your end users to know, because it is something that is going to be new. And that's around following the TXV adjustment guidance. So step 6, when you look at 404A, and this is versus, it could be any refrigerant. So 407A, 449A, even 448A, really any of the refrigerants that are being looked at as retrofit refrigerants for the low temp, medium temp refrigeration industry. The valves, especially the suction pressure to reach the same evaporator temperature, is lower for these new refrigerants. So one of the recommendations that I like to give on pretty much any 404A conversion is changing the power element from a 404A type element to an element that is compatible with the new refrigerant. So in the case of 449A, that could be either a 449A or 22 element. And even then, you really need to make sure that you close the TXVs when working with these refrigerants. You don't have to sweat out the existing valve and put in a new valve. You can use the existing body, but really changing the power element is a way to get better control with these refrigerants in the 404A design. Without any adjustment at all, you will see lower to negative superheats in your evaporator, which can lead to flood back, which can then lead to larger issues with the system. The other thing that's important to bring up with these conversions, especially for low temperature systems, is 404A has, while R22 has one of the highest discharge temperatures, 404A has one of the lowest. And then really all the other refrigerants that you work with are probably in between 22 and 404A. And it kind of depends on your situation, but really we recommend going and just doing a check on your compressor OEM to see if they recommend some type of demand cooling. I believe most of the participants here are likely in the Northeast. So there are situations, especially in the summer, where it might be needed, but most of the time, I'd say likely 90% of the time, you probably aren't going to reach a situation where it would turn on. So beyond the low temp demand cooling needs and the TXV adjustment guidance, everything else is pretty straightforward. For 404A conversions, if the system is running on POE, which hopefully it is, because that is really the only compatible oil with 404A, you do not have to change the oil. And then you also do not need to change the critical elastomeric seals for these conversions. So those are really the main points for this retrofit. If you can go to the next slide, Mark. This is the more, I guess, technical definition for really what's going on in the TXV. For the sake of time, we're probably not going to cover this today, but moral of the story, if you see a 404A conversion that you need to do, I think it is in the best interest of the contractor and the end user to change the power elements from a 404A to a 22 or 449A type element. We've seen both, and yeah, you might be able to get away with it with the 404A element, but long term, if you're looking at trying to run at maximum efficiency, especially if you consider what Sporlan recommends as well for their TXVs, that's typically the recommendation I like to give in the field. So if you go to the next slide. I believe we can provide these slides as needed, and this is being recorded. So this is a good chart to take a screenshot of. So it was made as part of the Sporlan document system considerations for refrigerant blends with temperature glide. And it tells you from 404A or from R22, and these are guidelines for retrofits to 407A, 407F, 448A, or 449A, what components need to be changed out in a conversion from their perspective. So if you go to the next slide, Mark, this is again the summary slide. So if you're rewatching this and you want to just get to the point, this would be the slide that you want to capture here, because this shows you really, so lubricant, elastomeric seals, expansion valves. I didn't mention filter dryers, but that's another one where anytime you do a retrofit, you want to change the filter dryers, discharge temperature, and then control. So if you're looking at a retrofit, and I know we're covering mostly 449A today, these are really the questions that I think you want to answer to be able to successfully implement the retrofit. You'll see that for 449A, this is essentially the same exact procedure as 407A. So if that's a refrigerant you've been using in the past, this procedure is going to be very similar to that. So if you go to the next slide, Mark. We get a number of questions on this, and it's an interesting one. So there's HCFC service gases that are used in the industries, things like HP80 or 408A, and that's very old equipment. And I think with some of the supply issues around some of those refrigerants, we get questions, hey, can I retrofit my HP80 or my 408A system to one of these new refrigerants? And honestly, you could retrofit anything, but the procedure for this is a lot more involved, because you're dealing with older equipment that the HP80 might have been retrofitted from, say, a 502 piece of equipment. So this could be maybe the second or third retrofit this piece of equipment has gone under. And then there's also questions around compatibility. So over the years, the compressor manufacturers have been making a number of improvements to their compressors. So you will see that beyond a certain date, some of that equipment is not recommended for retrofit. And in that case, it might be worth just trying to run out that equipment with HP80 and then, you know, replacing it with, say, 449A afterwards. But in a situation where you do want to do these conversions, and we do have, you know, we do have guidelines that go over this, is essentially you take what is a headache with the 22 conversions. So oil changes, seal changes. You take what is a headache with the 404A conversions. So changing the critical or changing the power elements, adjusting the TXVs, looking at the low temp discharge, temperature, demand, cooling needs, and combine them. In addition to making sure that the equipment is compatible, you will have what you need to do an HP80 conversion. It is something we have done. It's certainly not unprecedented for the industry, but these retrofits definitely require a bit more work than the retrofits we covered before. So if you go to the next slide, Mark. Again, this is just the 408A. Again, it's the same message. So you need to really make sure you're looking at equipment compatibility, oil, seals, power elements, and discharge temperature, demand, cooling needs. So if you go to the next slide. XP44. So XP44, I mentioned it before. There's very specific applications where this can be used. So if you have an application where you need to use transport refrigeration or remote condensing units, specifically low temperature ones, I believe it has SNAP approval for those applications. If you go to the next slide, Mark, I believe that has. So if you look at the metrics of things like capacity, COP, mass flow, suction pressure, discharge temperature, this refrigerant is a very, very close match to 404A. But because of its GWP and its restrictions in use, there's only certain places it can be used. So really the only advice I can give you is if you have an application that can be used with this product, yeah, it could be a great way to essentially half the GWP of the system, but it is restricted in where it can be used in the industry. So if you go to the next slide. 513A, mentioned that before too. So this one is essentially our lowest GWP non-flammable blend. So it's typically used in medium temperature applications, but there's also some applications that are in the pipeline, such as boosters, for example, that are being looked at using something like 513A. The other place we're seeing 513A being used is in like a cascade architecture. So for larger supermarkets, they'll use maybe CO2 for a low temperature loop and 513A for the medium temperature loop, and get, you know, really strong energy efficiency while also using essentially one of the lowest GWP non-flammable products in the industry. So if you go to the next slide. Mentioned this before, but XP10 or 513A is very similar to 134A. So if you look at capacity, it's got about a 3% higher capacity, slightly lower energy efficiency, so about maybe 2 to 3% lower we'd expect. So those two kind of counterbalance each other. 18% higher mass flow rate. So if you do run into, say, like a 20 or a 134A to 513A retrofit, you may have to adjust the valves post retrofit, just for the superheat likely will be a little higher without adjustment. Pressures are very similar, and then since it's a medium temperature fluid, its discharge temperature is not a concern. So if you go to the next slide, Mark, we get questions a lot, and this kind of fits into the same bucket as the 408A or 402A question. We get questions on MP39, MP66, 409A, even R12 sometimes. Is there a procedure for retrofitting that equipment to, say, like a 513A? And again, I can't stress it enough. Really, you got to make sure the equipment is compatible for the retrofit, right? You don't want to do a retrofit and then have more problems afterwards. So equipment compatibility is key. And then for these retrofits, again, since MP39, MP66, 409A, they're all HCFC service blends. You want to make sure that they have you know, an oil change and changing of the critical elastomeric seals for these retrofits. So if you go to the next slide. Great. So I think we wanted to cover real quick the call to action. Was that you, Mark?
Yeah, just, yep, we're in sort of good time. We've only got a couple slides left. So, yeah, at this point, just to sort of summarize, I mean, Andrew's gone through and given the low GWP solutions that the industry is going to move toward. With respect to revisiting this cap, and as we've discussed, most of the action is going to be happening in this decade, and being very upfront, we have a pretty significant challenge over these next 24 months. We're not only implementing a cap, but in 24 months, that cap's going to drop an additional 30%. And, we feel right now over sort of this next year and a half, that the cap that's put in place is sort of in balance with what the market demand is going to be for HFCs from an installed base standpoint. That will not be the case. And we want to stress that in 2024, that just sort of staying status quo over these 2 years is not good. So we're really sort of recommending, a stronger word would be asking, to make these key shifts to get ready for the second step down in 2024. So as we look at it, this is a 24-month horizon that we've got to prepare for. So the first one is 449 or 448 as the default design for any new installation. So, as a contractor or as you're dealing with your end users and new 404A equipment is being requested or spec'd, our ask is that you challenge the assumption, challenge why that is being spec'd. Most times, 98% of the time, it's because that's what we've been using the last 30 years. That's a faulty assumption now to be making going forward because of the fact that 404A is going to be hit the hardest because of this phase down. So the first shift is any new installation, 449 or 448. If it's 404A, it needs to be questioned and challenged hard. Okay. The second one, and so this first one's really sort of a stop the bleeding, right? That we cannot continue to increase the installed base of HFCs going forward in an environment where the HFC production caps are decreasing. That's just sort of a recipe for disaster. However, this second one is, I would argue, probably more important and a little bit harder, and that is going to require all of us to be a little proactive around this second step down in 2024. But the ask is to convert 30% of your 404A base by 2024. Oh, we didn't just pick that 30% out of the air. That's the step down number in 2024. That if we can stick close to this, when that step down, the second step down happens in 2024, then you're going to be moving your customer base from a service standpoint. You're going to be moving that down appropriately with respect to what's happening with the cap. If you can convert a little bit ahead of that 30% number, that just puts you in a little bit better spot. But at least to stay with the phase down, we're asking you to convert 30%. And sort of how we ask is, hey, identify your top 5 404A customers. Normally, most folks, their top 4 or 5 folks are 80% of their 404A users, right? So identify your top 5 customers and then develop a 2-year plan. Doesn't have to all be done Q1 2022, but to develop a 2-year plan to convert 30% of their 404A base. And I think as we sort of started this webinar, this point here is we've done this before, right? We've done this with R22. You convert 22, you pull that, recover that gas. It can be reused, it can be reclaimed, it can be recycled, and now you have service gas. You have 22 service gas. We're asking the same thing, right? Is to develop a 2-year plan, to start these conversions. And as you're doing that, you're generating, quote unquote, a lower cost source of 404A due to these conversions. Right? And then, so these are our two asks as sort of follow-ups, post webinar. We would recommend getting with either your Meier Supply branch or Meier Supply salesperson to start addressing these issues. Okay. I am going to step through these next couple charts very, very quickly. These are some tools that as you start to go through the conversions and new installations, that'll be available. These are up on our website. We've got a series, Check Up with Dr. Chuck. It's on our YouTube channel. These are sort of short videos they're very informative. And then just the Chemours technical support on our website and our tech to tech hotline. Okay. So the big takeaways, hey, the refrigerant regulation, the phase down is coming. Start putting a plan together regarding conversions. If you can stay on a conversion path, it's a cost-effective way by generating your own 404A and achieving regulatory compliance. Obviously, I stepped through this very quickly, but we do have a lot of tools and resources in the form of not only literature, but our tech support team and working with Meier Supply. And the big thing is, as we go through this, and this is really just sort of the first of what I think will be continuing education and support over these next 2 years, is work with your Meier Supply salesperson, work with us from Chemours, and certainly on getting the retrofit training, and then as Andrew discussed, more to come the back end of the decade around A2L readiness. Okay. So with that, I think we've got about maybe 8 to 10 minutes. So I'll open this up. I don't know if it's Brian or Dale or Jordan, if there's questions that have come in that Andrew and I can address.
Okay, Mark, it's going to be me reading the questions off to you. We've got a few in the chat box here. One of the first ones we have here is there a significant difference between 448A and 449A? Can the two be mixed in a system without issues?
So from a performance standpoint, in terms of operating conditions, there's not a big difference. The two cannot be mixed, and the reason why the two can't be mixed is, as Andrew had stepped through, 449 is a 4-component blend. 448 is a 5-component blend. 4 of the 5 components in both are the same, but that 5th component that's in 448, I'll be kind and say there's a little foo-foo dust in there to help with the IP. But for that reason, they can't be mixed.
Okay,
But
great.
from a performance standpoint, they're the same.
Okay, next question. When converting a 404A walk-in to 449A, would there be a large mismatch in evaporator capacity created?
Andrew, you want to take that one?
Sure. And I think this kind of goes into, one of the points we made before with, so converting a 404A walk-in to 449. I understand. So when working with a refrigerant with temperature glide, it's interesting. So one of the things you see is that if you're speccing or sizing a evaporator for a refrigerant with temperature glide, likely you're going to be getting extra capacity on the evaporator side. On the condenser side, the opposite is true if you kind of rate them traditionally how you were. So what you lose on one side, you might get back on the other, is typically what we've heard in the industry when doing the rating conditions based on the dew point. But where you can, I would recommend really trying to rate on the midpoint. And I think the easiest way I can explain this is, so take 449A, for example. There is there's roughly a 7-degree temperature glide on 449A. So whatever the temperature, or so if it's 7 degrees, then in the evaporator, for example, I would just account for the glide by, if you want to run a 20-degree evaporator with, say, 404A, you're probably going to want to run about a 23.5-degree evaporator for 449A. So you want a slightly higher evaporator temperature for the refrigerant with temperature glide, or a slightly higher dew point. And I think if you do that, you're going to see a closer capacity balance for the two refrigerants.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Andrew. Let's see our next question. What is the 5 to 10 year plan for the Cape Fear River Basin, Fayetteville, North Carolina? From PFAS.
Who? I have no idea. I'm sort of unfamiliar with the Cape Fear River Basin. But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, we leave that one for our other responses.
Right. Yeah, we'll sort that one out. Okay. Next question. We're assuming that you cannot use 513A on a low temp cap tube system without changing the cap tube. That's a big part of low temperature equipment market.
So
okay. Yeah, that's a new question that I've seen. I'd be happy to look at cap tube, sizing. Typically, I mean, it does have a little bit higher of a mass flow rate, so that could impact the sizing somewhat. But overall, we've seen the two refrigerants be very similar in performance. I would like to look into more detail before making a recommendation of if it's needed or not. But yeah, I do agree that having a refrigerant that is compatible, especially with existing cap tubes where applicable, is important for that low temp equipment.
Okay, great. We can include that in like our answers when we put them out at the end. Email, so we can put that in there. Has R448 replacement gas been tested in a cascade refrigeration system? And if so, is there a capacity loss? There was a 10% loss in efficiency when we changed from R13 to R508B.
So I guess the cascades I mentioned earlier, they were more for low temperature refrigeration or medium temperature refrigeration. So things like supermarkets. It sounds like that cascade, especially if I hear 508B, is probably for more of a very low temperature system. I would likely agree that there would probably be a capacity loss when comparing something like 508B versus 404A in those very low temperature systems. That is something that I think the industry is still trying to wrap its head around, is really what we want to do in that very low temperature space, because there's a number of high global warming potential refrigerants used there. So that's something that I think is still really in the pipeline for us, is trying to figure out, hey, how do we manage the very low temperature space?
Okay, great. Thank you. Next one is, what is the tech-to-tech hotline phone number again, please? They missed it.
Oh,
Brian, why don't we, what we'll do is we'll plan on posting that in the email that we'll circulate afterwards. Can you make a note? We'll make sure everybody gets that.
Yep. Great.
Yeah. And just to sort of add to this, so this tech-to-tech hotline, this is not only for conversions from 404A to 449. There's still a lot of 22 equipment out there, right? So if
Sure.
folks are on the HVAC side, if they're looking at converting 22 to like MO99 or new 22B, this is a great line to use to talk to our tech support team for those conversions and questions as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Next one, you mentioned the term mildly flammable. What exactly is considered mildly?
That's a very good question. And it's one we get a lot. So it is a unique term, and essentially it comes down to two things. One is the energy it takes to cause an ignition event, and then the velocity or the burning velocity of the flame. So when looking, and there's a number of YouTube videos out there that if you kind of look at what mild flammability means, I think it is something that is easier to see versus explain. But in short, compared to say like a hydrocarbon, it takes a lot more energy to ignite a mildly flammable refrigerant. So take like your typical spark that could ignite, say, a hydrocarbon, likely wouldn't do anything to a A2L. And then if you do have an ignition event, in some instances, the burning velocity is not as extreme as a hydrocarbon. So we've seen cases where you can have an ignition event and the flame can't propagate fast enough where it self-extinguishes itself. So there are some subtle differences to it, but I think it's important when, especially training or working on refrigerants, that we consider the highest safety standards as possible. So, even though it is a lower risk than say like a hydrocarbon from a flammability perspective, we still need to be mindful that there are situations where, practices may have to be changed from how they were used in the past.
Great, thank you. Next one here. What do you suggest for larger R22 systems using liquid recirculation pumps and or flooded evaporators? Are manufacturers going to move on the same refrigerants, or all coming up with their own refrigerants?
That's another good question. I'd say that is another one that, it's something that I think the industry is still trying to, better understand is what we want to do with 22 systems. I could say we have some papers out there where we've actually started to study different refrigerants with temperature glide in those systems. Historically, that's been something that I guess has been shunned in the industry, but some of our modeling competency today has made it such that we are, really trying to reevaluate it. And if there's certain systems you have in mind that you want us to look at, we're constantly running engineering assessments on that system to see if we could find solutions. Ideally, we would like to see an azeotrope or something with a lower glide being used in those systems. But right now, there's really not a great solution for the 22 liquid recirculating pump systems or flooded evaporators. So yeah, if there's specific systems you have in mind, happy to talk about it in more detail.
Okay, great. We got one last here. What is the cost projection for these refrigerants versus existing refrigerants, at least percentage wise?
Yeah, I think in general, what you're going to start. So if you look at sort of the pricing right now, that 404A is now in general the highest cost refrigerant of the common refrigerants out there. It's it just based on the supply and demand curve with the CO2 equivalent cap. We would expect that the pricing will sort of follow GWP in sort of a fully realized market. So the long and short of it is the higher GWP products are going to cost more. So the short answer is there's a decent gap right now between the price of 449 and 404A. That gap is only going to widen as we move through this decade. So yeah, I would expect 404A to have continued upward price pressure due to its high GWP.
Okay, then we just got one last one in. 410A is not on high priority of conversion list. What's the timeline for that?
So the timeline for that is, so for folks that are primarily in the air conditioning space, the answer for 2022, 2023, and 2024 is 410A, 410A, 410A. That will not change these next 3 years. In 2025, The OEMs will be coming out with systems that will no longer be charged with 410A. They'll come charged primarily with 454B. I think Goodman will come out with R32 systems, but in general, most of the industry will be coming out with new equipment in 2025 with 454B. As Andrew mentioned, both R32 and 454B are A2Ls. So they will be the first A2Ls that the industry uses. But once again, for the air conditioning space, you will continue to use 410A for the next 3 years with no change. And then mid-decade is when and only in new equipment will come out with 454B.
Okay, great. Just one more popped in real quick. I've heard that mineral oil dissolves in POE and that high purity of POE is not so much an issue or requirement as it was once believed. Is this accurate?
I could take that one. POE can dissolve a lot of things. So it wouldn't surprise me that small amounts of mineral oil likely could. I don't have the data to essentially back this up, but I think at a minimum you still want to do two oil changes. Really, and again, the first one it's really because, like we discussed before, there's situations where you can dissolve a lot of debris on the inside and have that start circulating on that first oil change. So doing the second oil change really helps remove some of that. I would say in the past, especially if you look at when people were first doing HFC retrofits, they were, I guess more stringent about saying, hey, we need to get to 5% residual mineral oil or less to work with these systems. I would say that in some cases I have seen that a little more relaxed, but you definitely want to make sure that you follow the retrofit guidelines. At least do 2 minimum to make sure that the system can operate properly and it's getting the lubrication it needs.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. That's all I have on here right now.
Okay, so hey, listen, Brian, great job, and thank you. And for those of you that still hung around here, I trust that you know a whole lot more about the HFC phase down than you did just an hour ago. So a couple of things to add here. So while a phase down is spelled out by the EPA, somebody had mentioned this, but if you monitor refrigerant pricing, you'll see some of the HFC pricing has already exceeded the cost of the long-term HFO Opteon solutions. So that's also a consideration. Keep track of that when you look for other change out opportunities. And then it's also important to note that used refrigerant recovery and reclamations is going to play an important role in the serviceability of existing HFC refrigerant. While we're a huge advocate of doing a change out and we want to provide the support, we want to be the consultant for you for change outs over to the Opteon solutions. Meier Supply does have a complete solution for servicing your refrigerant recovery needs. So I'd like to thank both our speakers, Mark Love and Andrew Petula from Chemours for presenting, and also the Meier Supply team for putting together a great informative webinar. That was incredible. So if you have any questions or any HFC systems that you want to change out, anything from system components to refrigerant recommendations, our sales team's ready. Our branches, they can help. Remember, we also have access to Mark and Andrew from Chemours for any change outs that may require their expertise. We'll be sending out a follow-up email. On that email, you can expect information on, well, that 800 tech number, as well as we're going to include a link over to Chemours website. They've got plenty of videos and loads of technical information that Mark had shared. And we'll be sending a copy of this presentation. Thank you, everybody. And thanks for being here, and enjoy your day.